All right, let's see how this goes. I'm on holiday here at the beach, so we'll see if any little kids come running in or anything like that. But we are working our way through the Bible, and we're just about ready to dive into the New Testament. But before we do that, we wanted to take some time to make sure that we understand at least a little bit about the setting for the New Testament. Because the New Testament started being written about 400 years or so after the Old Testament was completed, and there are some pretty important things that happened during those years that really make an impact on the New Testament, and knowing some of those things help you understand the New Testament a little better. So, for example, one of the things that happened was the rise of what they call Hellenism. Hellenism has to do basically with making the entire world Greek. It literally meant to speak Greek, but it came to refer to the acceptance of Greek culture outside of Greece, or more precisely, as one man has put it, the attempt to impose Greek culture, language, and religion upon all the various peoples conquered by Alexander. So you might say Alexander the Great was like a missionary, not just a conqueror. One man has written, from his teacher Aristotle, he had been taught the virtues of Greek philosophy and the Greek way of life. Although his journeys toward the East caused him to adopt non-Greek practices, and a Greek purist would be shocked at his assumption of the role of a deity, Alexander continued to think of himself as one who is bringing the blessings of Hellenism, as the Greek way of life is called, to the more backward parts of the world. Everybody's got a gospel, actually. You just turn on social media and everybody's promoting something. And for Alexander, he was promoting the gospel of Hellenism, become Greek. Now, how did Jews respond to that pressure? There were different groups of Jews, and they responded differently. First, there were the Jews who had been scattered all throughout the world. When the Persians came to power and permitted the return of the deported peoples, the majority of Jews actually didn't return, and these became the basis for what's called the diaspora, or the dispersion. And over time, they started moving all over the world, and they became very prosperous, and for the most part, they started acting a lot like the people around them. In other words, by and large, they were Hellenized. But back in Israel, it was different. And in Israel, there were basically two responses to Hellenism. On the one hand, there were those who counseled separatism and limited resistance. And on the other hand, there were those who insisted on the wisdom of measured assimilation and deliberate capitulation. And obviously, there were religious expressions of those responses and political expressions of those responses as well. So in terms of New Testament history, the two primary parties that represented the religious responses to Hellenism were the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And then the political responses were the Zealots and the Herodians. And I think you know these from the New Testament. And to understand the New Testament, you really need to understand something about these groups. First, the Sadducees. This was the group that basically stood for accommodation. Some say their name came from Zadok because they claimed to be descendants of Zadok, high priest of Solomon. They were rich and basically in charge of the temple. And one scholar I was reading explains that they apparently emerged from the Hasmoneans. They first appear as the party supporting and advising the Hasmonean rulers from the time of John Hyrcanus. Remember, Hasmonean is the name of the family of priests that came from the Maccabees. The Hasmoneans became rich, powerful, and less priestly, and more sort of wealthy aristocrats, really. And the Sadducees were closely associated with these rich priests, and so you find them mostly around Jerusalem, which is why you don't find many references to the Sadducees in Galilee, for example. But every time Jesus is in Jerusalem, he runs into some of these Sadducees. They were around the temple. They had great power in the temple. They controlled the Sanhedrin, actually. Not everyone in the Sanhedrin was a Sadducee, but they were the majority. And religiously, they rejected the traditions and laws outside of the Torah. For them, only the Torah was binding, and so they're known mostly for what they didn't believe. So they didn't believe, for example, in the resurrection. And for the most part, their religious interests were primarily about keeping the peace. They were what we would call maybe religious liberals. I'm not sure they had super strong convictions except let's stay in power. Obviously, they don't factor much into the beginnings of Jesus' ministry because he was mostly up in Galilee at that point, and they didn't mind him giving trouble to the Pharisees. It wasn't until he came down to Jerusalem, cleansed the temple, that they began to get really upset, and they were even willing to join with the Pharisees in trying to get rid of Jesus. So that's the Sadducees. Now the Pharisees. Pharisees were the party of resistance to Hellenism and to Gentile rule. They were serious about the Bible, and in addition to the Bible, their own interpretation of the Bible. They wanted to keep people from giving in to culture. Their name probably comes from the term to separate. They were the separated ones. They were named for their zeal for the law and their separation from the influences of Hellenism, at least their commitment to it. They wanted to avoid anything that would make them unclean or like a Gentile. And that's part of why they made up so many rules, actually. They felt the Old Testament needed some help. So the Old Testament might say, keep the Sabbath. But the Pharisees said, how? What does that mean to keep the Sabbath? So, as one man has written, they would say that you could not walk on the Sabbath through a field of grain because you might knock some grain off, and that would be reaping. And then you might step on it, and that would be threshing. And the wind might blow some, and that would be winnowing, and on and on. It was very legalistic. And they also had rules like if you had a toothache, you could put something on the outside of your gum, but you couldn't swallow something. I don't think, had aspirin or Panado in those days. But if they did, you couldn't have swallowed one. But you could have put it on the outside of the tooth. In Jesus' day, there were a lot of Pharisees. There were about 6,000 of them. 6,000 of them. Most scribes were Pharisees, or at least associated with the Pharisees. They had lots of influence. We tend to think of them as the bad guys, but they were very popular, and they pretty much controlled the synagogue. So on the religious side, you have the liberals, the Sadducees, and the conservatives, the Pharisees. And the political situation was similar. You had the Zealots and Herodians. The Zealots' solution to the Roman problem was rebellion. They were inspired by the Maccabees. They have been described as true spiritual children of the Maccabees, essentially a company of Jewish patriots motivated by deep religious convictions. In other words, they looked back on what had happened and they thought, let's do that again. Mostly they were up from Galilee, where Jesus was from. On the other hand, you also had the Herodians, and guess where they got their name from? Herod. They accepted the rule of Rome. They didn't really have a problem with it, and they were closely connected with the Sadducees and centered mostly in Judea. So there was lots going on, and there was a lot of discontentment, actually, and tension. And in Israel, for the most part, the people, the everyday person, was longing for deliverance. That's why the Pharisees were heroes to them, and zealots even. And so as a result, one of the very most important things you can know about this time period in general is that there was a deep longing for God to rescue them. You can see, I think, how God's getting everything ready for Jesus. If we look at their history, he disciplined the people through Babylon. He sent them back to the land through the Persians. He forced them to think about what was important from the Greeks. He encouraged them in God's faithfulness and their need of a king through the Maccabees, and created a longing for deliverance during the time of the Romans. And how did they think God would deliver them? They looked to the Old Testament, and one dominant idea that was gripping the people in Jesus' day was this expectation of a coming Messiah to deliver them from all of this. One of my former professors writes, "It is my persuasion that one very important element of the first century setting into which Jesus came is the remarkable spirit of messianic expectation with which the Jewish world was gripped at the time." They were longing for the promised deliverer that we read about in the Old Testament, but they weren't totally sure how he would appear. No single form of messianic expectation, he continues, was cherished by Jesus' contemporaries, but the hope of a military Messiah predominated. The promises of a prince of the house of David who would break the oppressor's yoke from his people's neck seemed to be, to many, to be designed for a time such as theirs, whether the yoke was imposed by a Herodian ruler or by a Roman governor. And as a result, the impact coming into the New Testament is that there were lots of false pretenders to the messiahship. And there were lots of would-be messiahs. And there was a general spirit of expectancy, which made the leaders of Israel who wanted peace with Rome very nervous. In other words, there was a storm brewing. The time is ripe for Jesus to appear. One man explains, as we look back over these so-called 400 silent years, we see God at work in history preparing everything for the appearing of the Messiah. Indeed, by the time of Christ's birth, there has been forged an amazing and, until that time, unique combination. The Greeks gave the world their language, culture, and a deep discontent with things as they were, both life and religion, along with the eager hunger for something new. Thus God, though they knew it not, unified the ancient world in language and culture from Spain to India. Greek was known everywhere. For the first time since Babel, almost 100 million people could be reached by one tongue. The Romans gave their world unparalleled law and administration, a transport system unknown before, and an overall military security in an empire estimating to be about 56 million people. Thus, by Christ's coming, the world was as a place of rest as it had not been for millenniums, embraced by an empire of all races, nations, free to exchange ideas within certain limits, governed by law, and defended by military might. The Jews gave to the world the Word of God, the knowledge and experience of the living God, the revelation of God's eternal purpose, the promise and anticipation of the Messiah. Through the Hellenists, there were synagogues throughout the whole Roman Empire and beyond, centers of Bible study and prayer and fellowship through which the living God could make himself known. The Word of God they translated into Greek, and their services heard of the promise of a coming Messiah. Numbers of Gentile converts, tired of their depravity and of the corruption of the Gentiles' religion, were attached to these synagogues. So we find a secure and mighty empire with a common language and culture, a common law and overall government, centers of Bible study and prayer, Greek speaking everywhere, from which the truth is disseminated. We find a discontent with things as they are, an eager anticipation of a coming Messiah, and highways along which the good news could be spread. Had there ever been such a combination of factors before? Surely it was the fullness of time when God sent his Son. That is the setting for the New Testament. And in our videos that follow, we're going to begin actually looking at the New Testament.